It was a late fall evening when John and his three friends Mark, Dave, and Sarah decided to embark on a weekend road trip to the wilderness of Montana. The plan was simple: to spend 2 days hiking through the vast mountains, crossing rivers, and enjoying the rugged beauty of the state. But none of them knew that this innocent adventure would soon lead them to a horrifying experience they would never forget. John, originally from New York, had recently moved to the West Coast and was eager to reconnect with his childhood friends. He had planned the trip meticulously, wanting to experience the untouched beauty of the mountains and forests of Montana. Mark, his childhood friend, had a love for outdoor adventure, while Sarah and Dave were the more cautious members of the group. Despite their differences in personality, they were all excited for the getaway. After a long drive, they reached the outskirts of the town of Bozeman, Montana, where they were to begin their hike. The air was crisp, and the sun was just beginning to dip below the horizon. They spent the night at a small, quaint inn, unaware of the sinister events that awaited them the next day. The next morning, after a quick breakfast, they packed their bags and geared up for the hike. The group made their way towards a secluded trail that led through the dense forest and over the treacherous mountain pass. The plan was to hike for about 8 hours and set up camp near a river by dusk. But from the start, things felt off. John and Mark led the group, riding their bikes down the winding road, while Sarah and Dave followed closely behind. The air felt heavier as they made their way deeper into the forest, the trees growing thicker, the shadows longer. There was something unsettling about the place, an eerie silence that seemed to press down on them, making every sound feel amplified. Around midday, their bikes began to malfunction. First, Mark's bike sputtered and came to a stop, forcing the group to pull over. As John and Mark tried to fix the bike, Sarah and Dave wandered around, attempting to find a small shop or hut where they could get supplies. There was nothing for miles. They had ventured deep into the forest, far from any civilization. "It's not just the bikes, it's the whole area," Dave said nervously. "I feel like we're being watched." John laughed it off. "Come on, Dave, it's just the wilderness. We've hiked before. A little trouble with the bikes won't stop us." But Sarah felt uneasy. The silence around them was almost deafening. She could feel her heartbeat quicken as she looked around, expecting something to emerge from the trees. The hairs on the back of her neck stood on end. Yet, they pushed forward, ignoring the growing sense of discomfort. As the sun began to set, casting an orange glow across the sky, the group continued down the winding path. The forest around them grew denser, and the temperature dropped. Eventually, they came across a strange sight, a dilapidated gas station, abandoned and overgrown with vines. Next to it stood a house, a single-story brick building that looked like it had been standing for centuries. The house was dark, its windows boarded up, but there was a faint light flickering from within. The group stopped, looking at the place with curiosity. There was something unsettling about the house, its isolation, its disrepair. It felt like a place that time had forgotten, but also one that should be avoided. Still, they needed help. Their bikes were in no condition to continue, and they were too far from the nearest town to turn back. They knocked on the door, hoping for some assistance. To their surprise, a young woman, no older than 20, opened the door. She had strikingly pale skin and long, dark hair, which she tucked behind her ear as she stepped out onto the porch. "Can I help you?" she asked, her voice soft, almost too calm for the situation. John explained their predicament, mentioning that they needed a place to stay for the night. The woman smiled, though her expression didn't quite reach her eyes. "I'll ask my mother. Please wait a moment," she said before disappearing inside. The group exchanged uneasy glances, but they had little choice but to wait. A few minutes later, the young woman returned with an elderly woman who looked ancient, far older than the young woman herself. Her face was lined with deep wrinkles, and she walked with a hunched back, leaning heavily on a cane. The two women exchanged a few words in a language John didn't understand, but then the younger woman gestured for them to come inside. "Come in. You can stay for the night," she said with a smile that seemed too forced. The house was dark and musty, the air thick with dust. The group followed the women upstairs to a small room. There was no modern furniture, only stone stools and tables. The walls were made of wood, but the space felt cold and uninviting. There were no windows, only a dim light hanging from the ceiling. The whole place had an aura of decay. The woman, whose name they later learned was Anna, promised to bring them food, but when they asked if they could pay, she simply nodded and left. The group sat down, trying to make the best of the situation. As the hours passed, an unsettling sense of dread grew within them. The house seemed to grow colder, and the sounds of the forest outside became muffled, as if something was pressing in on them from all sides. As they sat in silence, playing cards to pass the time, Anna returned with a tray of food. The smell was strange, a mix of herbs and something earthy, like a dish they had never tasted before. "Eat," Anna said softly. "You've had a long day. It will help you sleep." But something about the way she said it sent a chill down Sarah's spine. She glanced at Mark and Dave, both of whom were eyeing the food with suspicion. They politely declined to eat, but Anna insisted, even becoming a bit forceful. "Please, you must eat. It's for your own good," Anna said, her smile becoming more unsettling by the second. Finally, Sarah broke the silence. "Thank you, but we'll just rest for the night. We don't want to trouble you any further." Anna's expression darkened for a moment, but she quickly masked it with a smile. "I understand," she said, before turning and walking toward the door. "But you should leave as soon as you can. This place isn't safe after dark." The door creaked closed behind her, and the group exchanged nervous looks. They had planned to leave in the morning, but now something felt terribly wrong. As the night grew deeper, the sound of footsteps echoed from upstairs, though no one had entered the room. The creaking of old wood and the faint whispers seemed to grow louder, as if the house itself was alive. When they attempted to leave, they found the door locked from the outside. Panic set in. John tried to calm everyone down, but the atmosphere inside the house was suffocating. Every step they took felt like a misstep, every sound amplified in the eerie silence. Suddenly, there was a knock on the door. "Get out!" a voice hissed from the other side. It was Anna's voice, but it was no longer warm or inviting. It was cold, filled with malice. Before they could react, the door creaked open, revealing a shadowy figure in the doorway. The old woman stood there, her face twisted in a grotesque grin, her eyes glowing unnaturally in the dim light. "You shouldn't have stayed," she whispered. "Now you're ours." With adrenaline pumping through their veins, John and his friends bolted from the room. The house seemed to warp around them, the walls closing in, and the stairs becoming steeper. They grabbed their bikes and ran outside into the cold night. As they mounted their bikes, they felt an overwhelming presence behind them. Something was chasing them. They didn't look back, they just pedaled as fast as they could, hearts racing. The darkness seemed to envelop them, as if the forest itself was closing in around them. The bikes were working again, but they could hear footsteps and whispers behind them. Something was following them, but they couldn't see it. The trees seemed to shift and move, and the ground beneath them felt unstable. They could hear faint calls in the distance, as if someone or something was beckoning them back. Just as they reached the river, the night became even darker, and the temperature dropped dramatically. The water was black, and the current was swift. The group had to cross quickly before the sun fully set. But when they tried to board a boat to cross, the motor died unexpectedly. They struggled to row against the current, but the boat kept drifting toward the opposite bank. They were trapped in the middle of the river, their panic rising with each passing minute. As they read their respective prayers, The boat miraculously turned around and made its way to the shore, just as the last traces of daylight faded. Breathless and terrified, the group made it to the village by morning. But when they tried to explain what had happened, the locals simply looked at them with blank expressions. There was no house, no gas station. They had never seen the place John and his friends described. The river, though, was known as the Bloody River, a place where strange occurrences had been reported for years. Some locals claimed it was haunted, cursed, or worse. But no one would talk about it in detail. As John and his friends left the village, they knew they had experienced something beyond explanation. They would never return to those mountains again. Some nights, when the wind howls through the trees, John can still hear the whispers from the forest calling his name. He knows the forest is not just a place of nature. It is something darker, something that watches and waits for the next unsuspecting traveler to wander into its grasp. If you ever find yourself in the forests of Montana, be cautious of the paths you take, and never, under any circumstances, stop at a house that looks like it has been forgotten by time. For there are things in the woods that are better left undisturbed.